Good morning. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Scott Michaels. I'm the President of the Plumbing Products Industry Group. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Plumbing Products Industry Group, we are the premier voice of manufacturers and importers operating in the plumbing industry. And if you're thinking about becoming a member or have any questions, don't hesitate to talk to myself, Stuart Henry or Adam Degnan during the morning or afternoon tea breaks or during lunch. So the session today that I'm sharing is non-conforming building products, which, it goes without saying, is incredibly topical. In the construction industry, non-conforming products is a red hot issue, and plumbing has not been immune to that. Whether it's the issues in the Children's Hospital in Perth, whether it's issues in plumbing systems in Brisbane or Sydney. Last week we had issues with bubblers in Geelong. Our industry is not immune to the issues of non-conforming building products, and there is no doubt in 2018 the consumer has heightened expectations in terms of what our industry provides in terms of safe drinking water and sanitation. So we have three speakers today. Firstly, I'd like to call on Ivan Donaldson, who is the former General Manager of the Australian Building Codes Board, a position he held for 16 years. Ivan has a wealth of experience. He was intricately involved in the formation of the National Construction Code, and he is passionate about national standards in terms of industry. Ivan currently is the Director of Ivan Donaldson and Associates and consults to the plumbing industry. I'd like to welcome Ivan.
Good morning, everybody. This is a very broad cross-section of the industry, I can see, because I can only look in one direction and see half of you, but I can see the rest of you over there. Welcome to the presentations today. I've got good news for you. I'm not going to be providing any slides for you to be looking at, and I'm not going to focus on too much detail. I'm hoping to outline for you one aspect of the challenges that you as an industry face in your operating environment, and that's regulation. Now, generally speaking, when I worked in the ABCB, by about 10 o'clock we all fell asleep. You should appreciate it's a pretty dry subject, but I'll try and inject a little bit of relevance to your interests and to perhaps talk about, first of all, how on earth regulation changes in the big picture sense in this country. I'm going to look at plumbing, of course, and I'm going to talk about something called the Shergold-Weir report, and also a report that came out of London following the Grenfell Tower fire, which was released on Friday this last week, and perhaps to focus on where we might go now in terms of dealing with the challenges that the regulatory environment faces for us. It certainly is a state of uncertainty that we're in, not just because of commercial pressures or the global supply chain disruptions and technology change, but also regulation. I'd contend that consumers are not getting a good deal on price, quality, or security. I'd also say that plumbers are not getting a good deal because of the lack of certainty in the regulatory environment. And certainly product suppliers and manufacturers are not getting a good deal either because the playing field in which they operate is not even. I think that the regulatory system in Australia in which you operate is deaf or perhaps very hard of hearing, because there have been calls for change on a range of issues, not just plumbing products and the delivery of buildings in this country, but also right across the building industry. And that's been going on now for some years. But let's just go back and just think about what happens when significant change occurs in regulation. Why does it occur? Well, unfortunately, there's a sleeper, something that only wakes you up from time to time, and they're called catastrophic events. And there's a pattern, and that pattern's been there for a very long time. I'll just talk about Australia and perhaps refer to some international examples, but if I was to mention to any of you in this country who've been here perhaps for the last 50 years, a number of cities, and give you a date, I don't think I'll need to elaborate on what happened, and you may even know what the consequences were. Darwin, 1974. Newcastle, 1989. Victoria, 2009. We got a response to those terrible events, a regulatory response, and indeed we got a safer built environment in relation to floods, fire, earthquakes, and cyclones. It was at a cost, but it was at a cost that was understood by the community because it saw the consequences of inadequacy in the system. The regulations were not adequate to deal with those catastrophic risks, and if I was now to turn to plumbing and mention to you Perth, 2016, Sydney, 1998, and indeed Hong Kong in 2003, you'll recall, I'm sure, because you're an informed audience, what those issues were associated with threats to health and well-being in the community. Lead in water, potential exposure to disease, and indeed in the case of Hong Kong, a very grim consequence as a result of the failure of a plumbing system in an apartment building. Why didn't we act sooner? Why did we have to wait? Why don't we have a way of better dealing with catastrophic risk? The science is there. The intention is there. None of us want to be either responsible for, or indeed we would want to be in some way contributing to changes which can improve the built environment's regulatory environment and hopefully mitigate the impact of natural phenomena and the failures of ourselves as humans. It's actually a remarkable thing that I see the industry is actually taking a lead in trying to generate change. It's not the community, because the community, unfortunately, is not adequately informed. It's not the media, and it's absolutely extraordinary that the SICAP report in London, I don't think, has anyone seen any media press from Australia in the last 48 hours in relation to the consequences of the Grenfell fire? No, I haven't either. There's a proposal in that recommendation to abolish private certification in the UK. I'm going to come to a report that is directly relevant to Australia, the Shergold-Weir report, which actually seems to be suggesting the same sort of thing. Let me just talk about what the industry has been trying to achieve to better deal with risk and to safeguard the community better. We have been calling for some time to the relevant ministers who get together in something called the Building Ministers Forum. Anybody heard of the Building Ministers Forum? Thank you. I'm really pleased to see that about 10% of you do know what the Building Ministers Forum is, but you'd have to be following the agenda fairly closely to realise that, in fact, the Building Ministers Forum is responsible for plumbing in each of the states and territories. There are, in fact, 2 ministers who have direct responsibilities for plumbing in that group. The rest of them are essentially planners and have wider responsibilities, and to some extent that's something of an issue. We don't really have a dedicated set of political resources focused on the issues that face us. It's all indirect, and quite frankly the way things have been going recently, it's very difficult to identify where you can go to actually achieve the sort of collaboration and level of cooperation that the industry needs from government to deal with the issues. I was at one time. Neil, I apologise to you being here. Welcome, Neil Savory, General Manager of the ABCB. That was my role for 15 years. And there was a time when the ABCB had that central role. I'm not convinced that it still does. I would hope that it will. It certainly has a contribution to make, and it's a very, very important one, but we're still, the jury's still out on whether this resurgent Building Ministers Forum, which meets every 6 months or so, is going to be able to take the ball and run with it and achieve the sort of change we're looking for. So national leadership, to me, is an important issue, and that's what industry's been calling for. We also have been seeking a clearer voice on the national forums. The industry is well represented on the Plumbing Codes Committee within the ABCB, and indeed has one member, Murray Thomas, on the board itself, which is was a very welcome initiative when the National Construction Code was created some years ago to bring in the Plumbing Code. So we've got the report coming out of London, which is telling us essentially that the system is broken in the UK, and that is precisely what Peter Shergold and Bronwyn Weir have reported to ministers and indeed publicly to the situation in Australia. They essentially are saying that the whole system needs to be totally rethought. I have some issues with the Shergold report. I was disappointed that there wasn't an embracing of a national approach to the issues. It's true enough that the building ministers have welcomed the report. They have sent the states and territories away to reflect on the recommendations that have made, that indeed do bear on their legislation, because there is no overarching Commonwealth legislation in relation to the industry. But at the same time, my disappointment was at least mitigated to the point that the Shergold report did see merit in an issue that's dear to some of your hearts, and that's extending the watermark regulatory points to point of sale. That was found to have merit, and that was a welcome conclusion from Shergold and Weir. Also, the building ministers have seen themselves as needing to perhaps reach out to industry. They are now publishing a charter which actually will explain to you all, and I urge you to have a look at their website and encourage you to read what it is they do. And they've embraced Shergold to the extent of agreeing in principle to the way in which he'd like to go. So there is I think the door is hopefully open to more collaboration and discussion with industry, but we shall see how the ministers will respond to where we go from here. Watermark does need to be validated at point of sale. There's a debate about that as we speak, and strong points have been put forward by industry to see that achieved. Product certification services for industry also need to be more robust and transparent, especially when we're talking about new technology. Lead in water needs to be recognised as a problem and to be more rigorously managed. And government needs to start talking in a meaningful way to industry and show the leadership that we're looking for, so that we can work with it and be part of that leadership as an industry. I don't think it's good enough for Shergold to have dismissed calls for a national approach and hide behind the notion of competitive federalism, because that's where we are at the moment. My state's better than your state. I actually live in the ACT, but that's another story. Many flowers will bloom. I think that was something that Mao conjured up at one stage when he murdered 50,000 people, but 50 million people. It seems to me that we're much better if we're talking to government, we're working with government, and government and industry can argue the case about what's the best way forward. To close industry out of the processes of decision making strikes me as not being a very sensible approach. I'll leave it there. There's much behind what I just said in terms of detail, and I can't do that in the short time I have, and I've probably exceeded my time. But I'll leave it at that point. Thank you.
Thanks, Ivan. Whilst I said in my opening remarks that the issue of non-conformance is very topical, it also has a history, and for those of you who have a chance, I draw your attention to the article from 1986, which Jeff has put up today, which talks about non-compliance in tapware. So the issue has been there for quite some time, and I now call upon Robert Monro from the Queensland Building and Construction Commission. The Queensland Government has been at the forefront of introducing legislation which includes the concept of chain responsibility, where everyone in this room is accountable in Queensland in terms of when we are supplying product that's installed in the state of Queensland. So I welcome Robert.
Thank you. I'm very conscious of time. This is a fairly broad topic, but I'll keep it as brief as I can. So the Queensland Building and Construction Commission is the building regulator in Queensland, and in June last year, the government introduced the Non-Conforming Building Products Chain Responsibility and Other Amendments Act. About 2 weeks later, the tragedy in Grenfell occurred, so it was quite timely. The government had tried to push this forward. The bill became law on the 1st of November 2007, and it altered the Queensland Building and Construction Commission Act in that, for the first time, whilst we always looked at defective building work in Queensland, it was only aimed at the installer that we would pursue if there was defective building work. The NCBP means there's a chain of responsibility, so anyone in that supply chain of the defective work, the Queensland Building and Construction Commission can now look to. So I'm going to briefly just talk about who falls in that chain of responsibility. So if you design it, you manufacture it, you import it, or you supply it, as well as the person who installs it, you're now caught under the NCBP laws in Queensland. Sorry.
Orange button. Orange?
Sorry. I can talk without it.
Technology.
So what is a non-conforming building product? A non-conforming building product is a product that does not or will not comply with the relevant regulatory provisions. For example, the Building Code of Australia or Section 30 of the Standard Plumbing and Drainage Regulation, which requires, amongst other things, plumbing and drainage items to have standard mark, watermark, or type test mark certification. So a non-conforming building product is a building product that is not or will not be safe for its intended use, regardless of whether or not it conforms to the regulatory provisions and does not perform or is not capable of performing for its intended use and the standard that is represented. So the example of that recently is that the Non-Conforming Building Products Unit has come across a supplier in Queensland that was advertising that their product had passed an Australian standard. Further investigation by us realised that it was a fabrication. In fact, it had never passed any standard, but it was portrayed to the general public using that product that it had. So what are the building products that are captured by NCBP? A building product is defined as any material or other thing associated with or that could be associated with a building. So the definitions are: associated with is defined as incorporated into or connected to a building by the carrying out of relevant work. Relevant works definition means building work under the Plumbing and Drainage Act 2002 or the Building Act 1975. A building, in this term, means a building or other structure within the meaning of the Building Act 1975. As the definition of building product includes products connected to a building by the carrying out of relevant work, the definition also includes temporary things like formwork. There are, of course, things in a building, particularly domestic cottage construction, that aren't building work, usually in, and I'm talking particularly in Queensland or social of the other states, but obviously stuff like fridges, washing machines, dryers that may be part of the home package are not encapsulated as building work. So what is the primary duty of each person in the chain of responsibility? Each person in the chain of responsibility for a building product must, so far as reasonably practicable, ensure that the product is not a non-conforming building product for its intended use. Who is captured by the chain of responsibility? A person is in the chain of responsibility if they design, manufacture, import, supply or install a building product. A contractor and any subcontractor who installs the building product is also captured under the supply. So the obligations, depending on who you are in the chain of responsibility, depends on what your obligations under the chain of responsibility are. So firstly, the sharing of information that ensures everyone is educated as to the suitability of a product, its uses and its limits of its use, and the correct method of using the product to ensure that it is a conforming building product. The person in the chain of responsibility for a building product who designs the product must ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, that if the person gives the design to another person who is to give effect to the design is accompanied by the required information for the product. So in other words, the designer must provide the required information to the manufacturer for them to produce the product. A person in the chain of responsibility for a building product who manufactures, imports or supplies the product must ensure, so far as is reasonably practical, that when the person gives the product to another person, the product is accompanied by the required information for the product. In other words, the supplier, who may also be the manufacturer and or the importer, must provide the information to the installer. So under section 74AG of the QBCC Act, a person who installs a building product must ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, that the owner of the building is given the information about the product prescribed by the regulation. For each intended use of a building product, the product information must state or otherwise communicate the following things: the suitability of the product for the intended use, and if the product is suitable for the intended use only in a particular circumstance or subject to a particular condition, those particular conditions or circumstances must be notified. This is not exactly new, and most building products already come with or have available some form of evidence of suitability in 8.2.2 of the BCA. So examples of this would be a current certificate of conformity or accreditation issued by a product certification body which itself has been accredited by JASANS, or a report issued by a registered testing authority demonstrating that a product is fit for its intended use, or certification from a registered professional engineer which certifies that a building product design, composition and method of installation complies with the requirements of the NCC. So the only last one I wanted to touch on is that instructions about how the product must be associated with the building to ensure it is not a non-conforming building product for the intended use. This would most likely come in the form of technical data sheets and should also provide information with regard to limitations for the use of the product in a particular circumstance. So instructions about how the product must be used to ensure it is not a non-conforming building product for the intended use. This would most likely also be in the form of manufacturer's installation for the products. So my talk this morning, because this is a really broad topic and I've really skimmed over it in the time I've been allowed, I just wanted, because I understand there's various audience members in the supply chain that would be in this. Queensland is, as I'm aware, the only state so far that has passed legislation that has a chain of responsibility. So up until this point in Queensland, as I said before, it was really just the builder, the end installer that we pursued. But now it will be any one of those aforementioned categories of people that if a non-conforming building product comes to our attention, we would investigate.
Thanks, Rob. I'm now going to call upon Bonnie Ryan from GS1 Australia to talk about how the digital space can bring about greater accountability in terms of pursuing that chain of responsibility.
Thank you, Scott. Hello, everyone. This is a brand new audience for me, so thank you for having me, first of all. I haven't got too many slides, but I'm going to play you a little video. First of all, I'm going to ask a question before I do. Can I have a show of hands, and don't be shy if you haven't, who hasn't heard of GS1 and who we are? Great. All right, so it would take me all day to kind of explain to you the history and everything about our organisation. I'm going to play you a 3-minute video as an introduction so you get a bit of context, and then we'll take it from there. Thanks.
What What do you think of when you see this? A barcode? No more, no less. It's often taken to be just a price tag, but it has many other uses. With a barcode, you can find out if what's on your plate is really what it's claimed to be. A barcode will make sure you won't be fooled by pirates. And what about the terrace you're building at home? Are those planks fully legit? They're not from the rainforest, or are they? The code helps you keep track of your parcel all the way. After all, there are several million parcels on the move every day. What's more, you can track the cotton from the cotton fields all the way to the shop, so you know that everything along the supply chain is handled correctly. You probably don't know who we are, but one thing's for sure. We help make your life easier, more secure, and more sustainable. GS1, the global language of business.
Thank you. So now let me ask you another question. Who has been to a supermarket recently? Did you know that when you scan the product at the point of sale, that kicks off the replenishment of that product all the way up the supply chain? It's fully electronic. So I've only got limited time today, and I could talk about this for hours, trust me. But I want to focus on two things. First of all, I want to talk about the digital supply chain, and then I want to talk about trust. Okay, so let's address the first one first. So the digital supply chain is increasingly important. Okay, in every industry that we operate in, and there's 20 plus industries that GS1 play in globally, the supply chains are becoming ever more complex. Stuff is made everywhere in the world, it comes from everywhere in the world. So having surety and certainty about where stuff comes from, where it's been, how it's been handled, and has it been handled in a conforming way is increasingly difficult to kind of know, okay? And as we move more and more into the digital space, your digital supply chain and the information accompanying the physical products and the physical world is increasingly important. And from a product conformance point of view, you probably wouldn't want to be in a coroner's court and having to prove your supply chain and the traceability of the products that you play in. And if you're one of the participants in the chain of responsibility process, then having a paper, being able to do that in paper is not going to cut it. You're going to have to, really, the whole industry, the whole construction industry, in fact, it's not just the plumbing industry, is going to have to really rethink its digital supply chain and how it's going to manage traceability, visibility, and from end to end. Okay, so that's from a digital supply chain perspective. You probably, from a technology perspective, don't think that implementing a piece of software is going to solve your problems. There's plenty of great software out there and great technologies, but they're only as good as the information that you feed in. So the data, the information chain is really, really critical, and it has to be trusted. Okay, so just because you're getting a report out of a software package somewhere doesn't mean that the information that's been put in is accurate. So you have to be able to have a digital audit trail. So GS1 as an organisation is a global standards body, so we provide a framework and data standards for supply chains right across the world, across all industries. And we work with industry to understand what the requirements are and help you to improve and implement your digital supply chain over time. So I hope that this is I don't know how much time I've got left, probably not much. So I hope that's a pretty good kind of overview. It's a very, very large topic. It's a very critical one, but you can't not focus on your digital supply chain as well as your physical one. The two go hand in hand, and it's going to be ever more important. And the data, really, really, really critical. It has to be accurate. It has to be trusted. So, you know, if we do have an incident, heaven forbid, like London did, you know, we need to be able to prove, you know, what materials went into what buildings, so that, and we need to be able to do it easily, you know, just for the safety of everyone, really. So, yeah, I think I might wrap it up there. I can take some questions, or I'm going to join the panel and take questions. Yeah.
I'm conscious of time because we are at morning tea, but does anyone have any questions for the panel?
I just want to ask, in terms of the training of responsibility, when will that be rolled across other states? Do you know if that's it will be South Wales and the rest of Australia, or is it just Queensland?
At the moment, it's just Queensland at that Building Ministers Forum. Sorry, at the moment it's just Queensland, but I know they are talking about it at the Building Ministers Forum. There was some talk that they were going to model the rest of the states on Queensland, but they haven't. I noticed that what they're reducing in New South Wales does vary from some degree to what was established in Queensland. So, to answer your question, it is only Queensland at the moment.
Yeah. Roland.
Yes, this is a question for Bonnie. Bonnie, you talked about barcodes as being a really important part of the digital supply chain. The expectation with blockchain is it will go beyond traceability to visibility across the whole supply chain. Where is GSK in that discussion around the implementation of blockchain?
Yep. So it's just one, sorry. That's okay. So blockchain is basically a technology. Okay, so the data standards are really agnostic of the technology piece. So blockchain is really, you know, a distributed ledger of databases in which you have to put data into. Okay, so GS1 sits before that in terms of having prescriptions and quality around the data that you subscribe. Because you can put data into a blockchain and share that and it'll lock it down and provide visibility. But if it's not accurate and it's not trusted and you don't know where it's come from, then it's, you may as well, you know, it's useless. It's compromised. So you have to really, you know, distinguish the technology piece from the data piece, because technologies will come and go. We've got RFID, we've got Internet of Things, we've got blockchain, Industry 4.0, and so it goes. Okay, but every piece of technology must be fed, if you like, with good quality data, and it must have an audit trail to understand where that data has come from. Otherwise, you're compromising the technology. Does that make sense? Yeah?
Peter.
This one's for Robert. With the continuing rollout of the non-conforming building products in Queensland, what about if the homeowner imports it himself off some manufacturer on the internet who isn't registered? Where does the responsibility then lie once that turns up at the house and he gives it to the plumber to install?
That's a very good question. Look, to be honest, my reading of the Act would be with the homeowner. I think they're captured by it. If the homeowner, particularly in Queensland, if they take an owner builder permit, or even if they don't, if they're importing their own product, they in fact become the importer. If they then give it to the builder, there's an obligation on that homeowner, because they step in the shoes of the importer, to pass on the relevant details and ensure that it's a compliant product within this country. So Queensland would look at the installer as we always have done prior to this changing of legislation. But in that particular instance, I believe that there's a fair chance that the homeowner will be caught up in it as well.
Question for Ivan. In regard to the watermark is really important right through the entire industry, from installer all the way back to manufacturer. In your presentation, you touched on the privatisation of certification bodies. Is there an acceptance that the pathway to watermark can be easier with some certification bodies than others? And I know I'm going to open Pandora's box here, but fair enough, because it's an issue for manufacturers.
Fortunately, actually, what I was referring to was the certification of buildings, not the certification of products. That's what the UK's apparently has a recommendation before it. I wasn't making any comment other than the general observation that there is a question mark over the robust nature of the way in which certification of products is policed in Australia. As a matter of fact, I have just been appointed by the Victorian Government and Swinburne University to explore with a number of research groups the question of how we can better manage access for people with new products to the Australian market through some sort of clearinghouse about the credibility of certifying service providers in the country. That's at a very early stage, but there is a recognition in government that there are sensitivities around the performance of some certifying bodies in Australia, and that's an issue that government is seriously looking at, as I understand it, and certainly the reason I've been appointed to this Victorian initiative.
The last thing we really need is an erosion of the watermark, because it's important to all of us. So we've already got one of the largest commercial builders in Australia who's not accepting even the test reports that have been done. It's causing great damage around the place, and I think it's a matter of urgency that we address that.
There will also be an opportunity to talk about certification issues in some of the later panels during the day. Jeff.
My question's to Robert Monro. Who is it that's bringing to your attention a product as non-conforming? How do you know about it?
Okay, so on the QBCC website, which I encourage you to go on if you're interested in the non-conforming legislation, because there's quite a lot of fact sheets and guidance. There's also 3 forms on there that you can lodge an online form if you are in the supply chain and you're expecting that there's a non-conforming product. So far, we've been in operation for 6 months with this legislation. We've received about 75 complaints. For this room's information, only 2 of those have actually related to plumbing products. Most of them, because it's so topical at the moment, are in relation to fire panels, fire separating walls, collars, penetrations. All of those, we have not had the staff to do proactive investigations as yet in the field, so they're all coming through complaint forms. To be honest, I think some of them are probably competitors trying to dob on each other just to get them a bit of a rev up, I would suspect. And we anticipated this would certainly be the case. One very bizarre one was a person told us that Bunnings' shower-proof glass was only 5mm, not reported 6. So I don't know who would go in measuring Bunnings' glass. So it's coming from a variety of different people. But essentially, to answer your question, sir, anyone can lodge if they suspect it's a non-conforming building product if they're in the supply chain or are in fact the owner of the building.
2 more questions. The gentleman. The one over the back.
Sorry, just to follow on with the question with relation to product in Queensland. You were saying, Robert, if you have a competitor that you're aware that they've got a shed full of product that carry the watermark and it's actively being sold out into the marketplace, are you likely to act on that?
So you said it does have watermark?
It does have watermark, but it doesn't comply.
Yes, we would. Look, yes, to answer your question, if any complaint came in, we would assess it, and as long as it wasn't just simply vexatious, if there was grounds to investigate, we would, absolutely. So an example is that there was and some of this have to be careful what I say because Section 110 of the QBCC Act means I can't talk about current investigations, but there was a supplier in Queensland who was selling tapware that we initially believed wasn't watermarked because the ABCB told us it wasn't. They then confirmed that it was, but by that stage we'd already had the tap tested. It failed 40-20 for metal extraction, but clearly at one point those taps had passed. So even if we have a pass-fail situation, we'll still continue the dialogue with that supplier and the importer.
Final question.
Yes, my name is Carsten Anderson. I represent Pentair. We're a $1 billion supplier to the global market of water filtration cartridges. My question is to Mr. Monro and Mr. Donaldson, and it relates again to the issue of claims with regard to marking of products. We operate within a standard called 3497. However, the actual claims that needs to be met to fulfill the 3497 is in a standard called 4348. And I just have a question about how you are dealing with these issues, because what this standard says is that you can have your claims validated by NSF or any other laboratory that can meet the NSF laboratory specification. However, there is no laboratory in Australia that can meet that, and what we're seeing now is an increasing number of people gaining watermarks without being able to have NSF certification. So I guess from my perspective, we are a big supporter of bringing the point of use legislation in. However, we are not confident in the actual system, in as much as we are seeing an increase of people getting products registered which cannot really validate the claims that they're making on their products.
I really am going to have to defer to...
And can I just make one point here is, and Mr. Donaldson, I think it would be really good if you could suggest something, because we have brought this issue to Jasan's attention. We have also brought it to the ABCB attention, and so far we are not able to have anyone to give any guidance on the matter. I think maybe what is happening is, these bodies have sufficient technical understanding of the standards and the resources to actually to undertake a proper evaluation?
I think that, given that there are representatives from Jazance and the ABCB here today, I think we should refer that question to a later panel.
Yes, I agree.